Um, really excited to everyone to be here. Thanks for joining me. I'm really glad that I am not going to be talking about the problems I created in the boreal forest, although maybe in the second block we can talk about a few challenges that we had to solve along the way. Before I share my screen and get started, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Boulder, Colorado, the ancestral lands of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples, and contemporary associations with almost 50 tribes today. And through my role as an academic administrator, we are working with many of these indigenous communities on water rights, sovereignty rights, water use here in the Front Range. I'm going to be presenting quite a lot of results from Alaska in the Fairbanks area. My fieldwork is located on the lands of the Dena people. And, our work there is, trying to support community participatory research, which I am really happy to talk about as well, particularly through my role in the newly formed Navigating the New Arctic Community Office that INSTAAR is playing a role in. So with that acknowledgement about the really important ties of my research to those communities, I would like to share my screen and get started. There we go. All right. So, I am an ecologist. I have been fascinated by disturbance and fire patterns on the landscape for a long time. And I think what you're going to see is some of the issues that I'm going to talk about today. I'm really going to approach from the lens of ecology, both from landscape ecology viewpoints, but also using ecosystem ecology frameworks. And I want to start by, overall, I hope I leave you today with like a fascination and love of the beauty of working in the North. But there are a lot of really fascinating conceptual and scientific reasons why I think, working in taiga regions, particularly this transition between boreal and Arctic biomes, is fascinating. And the first concept I want to drill in with you is the term legacies. And I use the term legacy to describe any scenario where something from the past, some state, some attribute from the past influences contemporary dynamics of a state. And in my case, I'm often thinking about how past legacies influence contemporary and even future ecosystem function. We tend to sort of separate or differentiate different types of legacies. Information legacies I'm going to talk to you about in the next couple of slides in terms of repeated successional cycles post-fire. But much of my work thinks about how material legacies, peat buildup on the landscape, permafrost formation over time, how these physical or material legacies actually shapes modern disturbance regimes. And so I'm going to wind our way today through several stories or vignettes that kind of cover almost all of these types of legacies. And I will not do this justice, but something that we are thinking very strongly about today is the role of social legacies in wise use of the land and stewardship of some of these resources. And again, that would be a topic I would love to discuss with you all later. And so I'm just fascinated by history and the role of wildfire sort of marching across the North American boreal forest, in a period of time that actually wasn't that conducive, or it didn't fit in our framework of a climate period conducive to fire. And the very history of fire in the North American boreal forest is a testament to the strong relationship between climate, wildfire, and vegetation. There's a strong historical legacy relationship between Black spruce and our modern fire regime today. And over the past few thousands of years, these repeated cycles, every century to century and a half, a wildfire followed by very repeatable patterns of vegetation recovery has led to a very strong information legacy, strong successional dynamics that today we know plays a really strong role in the success of my vote for the Canadian tree, which should be the national tree in Canada. Forget the maple. I want to nominate black spruce. This tree is strong, it's a survivor, and it's scrappy across the landscape. Here I'm showing you a couple of different pictures of black spruce in just very different hydrologic settings. Even in the muckiest and wettest of peatlands where I feel personally at home, we find black spruce. And, in fact, in Western Canada and Alaska, black spruce is the dominant land cover type. It represents, at least 60 to 70% of forest cover in interior Alaska. And this success story of this single tree species has a lot to do with this historical fire legacy. And this is something that we are really interested in the Bonanza Creek LTR, Long-Term Ecological Research Program, where I've been a research scientist for the past 20 years. And of course, we want to understand this legacy relationship between fire, climate, and black spruce, as well as other major vegetation and fuel types, because we know that we are witnessing a transformation of the boreal fire regime today. A longer fire season, periods of more intense fire activity in parts of the fire season, fires burning later into the fall than ever before, and this sort of general increase in annual burned area. And this is true for Western Canada, so some Western provinces, as well as interior Alaska. So we're interested in how a changing fire regime might start to interplay with some of those legacy relationships from the past 5,000 years. About a decade, it doesn't feel like it's been that long, but about a decade ago, a group of us within the Bonanza Creek LTER started to formulate a conceptual model that has driven the past 10 to 15 years of our research. And so this was really research that we had been testing in pieces, but we were able to kind of put it all together in this alternative stable state model. And we've built on this since then, but I want to present to you sort of the original conceptual model. And this model is trying to do justice to that legacy relationship that I just explained. Black spruce regenerates or self-replaces itself immediately after fire in typical post-fire conditions in the North American boreal forest, because it's that scrappy survivor. It can regenerate in a poor quality seed bed where fire leaves residual organic soils across the landscape post-fire. These are not soil conditions that are really conducive for deciduous regeneration or deciduous sprouting. And so black spruce is able to hang on in those stressful conditions, and it then has a competitive advantage in the successional framework. So under low to moderate fire severity conditions, black spruce is able to self-replace. And this is a very dominant successional cycle and pathway across the North American boreal. But what we are seeing experimentally in our long-term chronosequence reconstructions across the landscape and in our ecosystem models is that when fires become more intense, have greater severity, which I'll talk a lot more in the next few slides, and consume all of the organic layer from the ground layer, from the fuels, that competitive advantage of black spruce is lost. And when we see mineral soils exposed post-fire under these more extreme burning conditions, those are the ecological conditions where deciduous species have the competitive advantage. And so we see this shift away from favoring black spruce regeneration into favoring deciduous expansion because of a changing fire regime. And so this gets me really excited. I really love to think about those material legacies, of which peat or organic soil is a really good example, and how this layer built up on the ground over time, largely as a result of impeded decomposition, how that influences contemporary ecosystem function. And this is a great model to test some of those connections between above and below ground interactions. And so through many collaborations and over the course of many years, we've used 2 megafire years to test some hypotheses related to the conceptual model that I just presented to you. What is the role of ground layer burning? What is the role of depth of burning of those ground layer fuels in driving successional, vegetation succession of carbon fluxes over a decadal period of time? These were the questions we wanted to ask using these 2 case studies. In 2004, Interior Alaska experienced a massive fire season, kind of the season unlike no other. And then that was repeated in 2014 in the Northwest Territories of Canada. In both of these 2 cases, there are some really, really interesting similarities between how the fire season started. They do represent sort of 2 different kinds of case studies in 2 pretty different ecoregions, but nonetheless, both of these are epic fire events that really led to some catastrophic ecological and societal impacts for communities in these regions. So in both of these scenarios, we ran widespread field campaigns. So in the Alaska study, we established 350 sites across, a gradient of about 300 kilometers, sort of stretching a few hours north drive of Fairbanks and a few hours south. So a big radius around the city of Fairbanks, covering a wide range of ecoregions and soil moisture conditions, really focusing on systems that burned as black spruce. What do they become after fire? And then we repeated that design in 2014 in the Northwest Territories. So hundreds of field plots. In the Northwest Territories, our latitudinal gradient spans 600 kilometers. And again, our plots cover a range of ecological conditions, and they really zone in primarily on sites that burned in 2014 as black spruce. We characterize combustion rates, and then we're tracking what happens in years following. So I'm a big fan. I love experiments, and I will talk about them later, but I'm also a big fan of these large scale field campaigns that incorporate into their design heterogeneous conditions in both fire conditions as well as ecological conditions. So I'm only going to show a couple summary results from these field campaigns. And I'm actually going to really focus initially on the Alaska work. This work was really interesting because we were testing hypotheses about fuel consumption between different parts of the fire season. So in Alaska, early season fires, they often start in May. We define them, up until late June or mid-July, sort of peak biomass or growing period in this region. Early season fires are common, but their severity in terms of penetrating that ground layer is pretty limited because we have frozen soils all across the landscape because of seasonal ice dynamics at that time. Late season, we lose the seasonal ice, and unless we're working in a permafrost ecosystem, which I'll talk about later, there aren't those constraints on depth of consumption. So we were really interested in these different windows of burning and how they impacted fuel combustion. And what you can see as you move across this simple bar chart is, across all of the different kinds of landscape types that we included in our design, late season fire activity was always associated with greater rates of fuel combustion, and 80 to 85% of these fuel combustion rates are driven by ground layer combustion. So in these northern systems, what's burning is predominantly what's accumulating on the ground. And so that late season window is when northern ecosystems are very vulnerable to deep burning. And that was true across the landscape, except in the wettest of our conditions, these flat lowland peatlands and permafrost forests, where there were no differences in depth of burning between any window that we defined. And so these are the systems that are a little bit more resistant to those deep penetrating fires later in the season. And this makes sense because we have a high defined water table in peatland systems, or we have a frozen layer that remains frozen because of permafrost in our permafrost forests. And so these were data we collected soon after fire in that 2004 window and analyze those data. But really the point of this study was to relate the variation in ground layer consumption, those data I just showed you, with longer term patterns of vegetation recovery. And that's what we've been able to do by tracking these same plots, these inventory plots over time. So this is work of one of my students, Carolyn Gibson, who returned to these Alaskan plots. Again, these were inventoried for both above ground and below ground fuel consumption following the 2004 fires. And she was able to look at an early window of 10 years of vegetation succession. This early window, this first year of post-fire succession, really sets the stage for the community to follow. And Jill Johnstone's work has shown that really nicely. What we saw in our data set is very strong relationships between the depth of ground layer consumption along the x-axis and a proliferation or expansion of deciduous stems, deciduous species, deciduous proliferation. And that came at the expense of conifers, including black spruce. There we go. And so what we were able to tell from this large scale field campaign really validated what the models were suggesting in more of a conceptual framework, that severe burning and loss of that organic soil layer has the potential to provide a competitive advantage to deciduous species. And so we see these relationships between severe fire activity and what we call expanding deciduousness across the landscape. And, I just wanted to show these two pictures here of a black spruce landscape and sort of a more deciduous dominated landscape in the boreal forest. If you just think about the differences between these two types of forest cover, not only are they interacting with and responding to disturbances like fire differently, but they cycle carbon, nutrients differently, they hold water differently, they have wildly different rates of evapotranspiration, they have different associations with wildlife and biodiversity, and human communities in and around Alaska and in and around the communities I work with in Northwest Territories also use these landscapes very differently. So throughout the entire coupled socio-ecological model, these two different forest cover types just bring very, very different sets of conditions with them, and they play different roles in how the biosphere interacts with the climate system. We currently think of the boreal forest as a conifer-dominated biome and state. What's going to happen over the next 50 to 150 years or so if fire really takes hold and unlocks Black spruce's successional dominance in the North American region over time? These are questions we're continuing to ask. Happy to kind of return to this theme later. But I want to switch over and focus on part of the landscape that I think from a fire perspective often gets undersold or underplayed. And that is the role of these very widespread flat lowlands. These are the carbon powerhouses of the landscape, peatlands and permafrost lowlands. I showed you earlier that there was some evidence in our data that they were able to withstand deep burning late in the season. So I want to kind of poke at that a little bit more. I will never, ever exit a seminar, I hope, in my career without talking about the wonders of sphagnum moss. So this is a genus of mosses, of bryophyte species that I am totally fascinated by. Non-vascular species are different than the vascular world, but they are not more primitive. They are not less developed. They have just evolved differently to suit their evolutionary and ecological functions. So I'm holding a little bouquet of sphagnum mosses with their capitula at the top here. These are actually embryonic and young leaves that will then develop and grow upwards over time. And this is a scanning electron micrograph of the hyaline cell structure. So internal to sphagnum cells is a fascinating story that is actually an evolutionary developmental story. So when sphagnum leaves develop, 100% of their cells are photosynthetic and live. They're green cells. At some point in early development, there is a trigger or a cue for the plant to resorb half of those living cells. Half of its photosynthetic material gets resorbed. The plant somehow retains the contents of those cells. And this web of photosynthetic cells interlaced with these dead hyaline cells forms the structure of mature sphagnum. These hyaline cells set the stage for sphagnum as uber sponges. These mosses hold so much water on the landscape because of this hyaline cell structure. Hyaline cells also host a wide variety of microorganisms. They have their own microbiomes. It's just fascinating. This is one strong component or mechanism underpinning the ability for peatlands to withstand fire. Peatlands burn. 20 years ago, I couldn't stand in front of a fire group and say that without kind of being criticized. We know these ecosystems burn. They just usually burn pretty mildly or infrequently because of resilience or resistance mechanisms like sphagnum cover. But often we do find that these peatlands burn. And when they do burn, like this field image shows, often the only fuel left on the landscape are sphagnum fuscum hummocks, these white mounds that we often call sheep because they look like sheep. They're bleached out sphagnum hummocks that withstand fire because of high moisture content. These can actually refragment, regenerate, and go on to form islands of vegetation recovery over time. So I clearly need to move away from this slide because I'm getting very excited about sphagnum. So I'm interested in these resilience mechanisms and understanding when they can get overwhelmed, because resilience mechanisms always have a threshold. They always have a limit, and understanding those limits is important to making predictions about a changing fire regime. And sometimes to understand those limits, we need to turn to experiments. And I often create our own experimental designs. We do that in the field. We also do that in the laboratory. But today I want to talk to you about a serendipitous experiment. This is a sort of natural experiment. Well, it's not a natural experiment. It's an experiment that I stumbled into. And I talk a lot on social media about, the power of having an informed mind, of knowing when is a good opportunity, when to take that opportunity as a student or as a young researcher. And sometimes it also involves sheer luck. So I, way back when, was sitting in the Edmonton Air Photo Library, because that's what we used to do to choose our field sites. And I was mindlessly, brain-numbingly flipping through air photos across northern Alberta. And I stopped and I went back 5 photos because I realized I saw something very unusual. And if you can squint, you can probably see, well, first of all, you see the beautiful Sawtooth River. This intersects northern Alberta near the town of Chisholm. There's a gorgeous rich fen that you can kind of see and outline here. It extends on either side of the river. But then if you squint, maybe you see this unusual skeleton, which I just had to go out and visit myself because I did not understand what this was. So it turns out that this was a legacy experiment of drainage ditches and networks created by the provincial government of Alberta to test the economic feasibility of silviculture, of tree harvesting in peatlands across northern Alberta. So there's a ton of silviculture and wood production in upland forests. Can they do it in lowland forests? And so they drained the peat to try to grow trees bigger, and they calculated how much it would cost to do this and then get the trees out to the road. And they decided it was financially not feasible, not economical to do this. And they just abandoned this series of drainage plots. Plots were still draining the peat. 20 years later, I discovered this experiment, was able to go back and take a look and see what these plots looked like. These are huge plots. They're 40 meters by about 80 meters in diameter. There is a couple of different spacings. Here's where luck comes in. A few years prior to me finding this experiment and this image and visiting this site, half of this drainage network burned in a pretty severe fire called the Chisholm Fire that burned just around the year 2000. And so what was created without any effort of mine was a 2x2 factorial design where we had drained plots in and around this network of drainage trenches. We had undrained fen outside and away from the drainage networks, and about half of the drained plots had burned in the Chisholm Fire. And so I was able to sample across that experimental space of burning, yes, no, and drainage, yes, no. And I was really interested in whether some of those resistance mechanisms that prohibit peat from burning deeply were overwhelmed through this experiment. And so I'm showing you depth of burn in just centimeters of burn, so we can determine how much peat used to be there and how much was lost in those drained versus undrained plots. And when we take a look at the bulk density and the carbon concentrations of the peat, what we determined is that there was a 7-fold increase in carbon combustion post-drainage. So the plots that were drained burned more deeply, and this released 7 times more carbon through just the combustion process than our undrained plots. A really good example of how those resistance mechanisms can be overwhelmed, in this case by anthropogenic drainage. Nick Kettridge was a postdoctoral fellow that worked with my group. He is now in his own position in the UK, and he was able to follow up years later and look at sort of longer term consequences of both fire and drainage on vegetation recovery. And that combination of burning and drainage just set a completely new ecosystem state. We don't actually know what to call it. It's not a meadow, it's not a grassland, it's not a peatland. It's a new set of ecological combinations for this region of Alberta because of these compound disturbances. What's very important is there is no evidence of moss recovery, and that moss layer really leads to the development of peat, and that is really what sets the stage for a lot of our understanding of fire resistance or resistance to deep burning. And what we can say safely is when these systems get whacked by compound disturbances, we see clear signs of those mechanisms being eroded away and not recovering, despite 20 years of recovery. So I think, we're learning a lot about a changing fire regime in the boreal forest system, in boreal peatlands. We're learning a lot about the longer term consequences, both decadal, but then how might that carry out even into longer timeframes? What is the future of the boreal forest? I think all eyes are on the north right now to understand whether we're currently seeing a new regime open up in the Arctic. Are we seeing a boreal fire regime push further north? And I'm going to put big question mark around this because I think what we're watching is some early evidence of change, and we're just going to need to learn more about it. So I co-authored a perspective or opinion piece with the McCarty et al. And if you are on social media, you can give a little chuckle to that. This is a great example of how the community can come together over social media. This was a paper we wrote on Twitter because we realized there were a number of us that were analyzing remote sensing, analyzing Sentinel data in live action on social media as northern Siberia caught on fire. And that happened in 2019. It was repeated last summer. And we got really interested in the patterns that we were seeing. Again, early evidence of a shifting fire regime in the Arctic of Russia. We're not seeing that happen in places like Northwest Canada yet, but I'll be curious to see whether that is more to come. I want to segue into a quick perusal into another topic I'm really passionate about, which is permafrost. But I do just want to wrap up this section on fire by saying that last year's burning of the Russian Arctic burned into the world's most sensitive permafrost. This is Yedema permafrost in the Yakutsk area. It is the most carbon rich, and it is the most ground ice rich permafrost in the world. And this is just one sentinel image of all the interpretation of different kinds of burning conditions that we saw in that area. Lots of active flaming, smoldering, some signs of residual fire. So clearly this is already a fire-shaped region. And we will be able to monitor through this imagery changes in permafrost stability over time, because we know that what those permafrost changes will manifest in this landscape. And over the next few minutes, I'll talk more quickly about permafrost. I do want to just give you a sense of some of the landscape changes that are happening as a result of permafrost thaw. Some permafrost can thaw through warming, but some of it thaws through fire. So permafrost is frozen ground stuff, earth material that stays perennially frozen for more than a few years. And I think what's really important to note is that permafrost is subsurface. So it is buried underneath an active layer that freezes and thaws annually. This makes it really difficult to study permafrost because we can't directly assess it using remote sensing. So we need to use indicators of change to tell us something about how permafrost is responding to environmental change. Permafrost is also extremely heterogeneous. It can be made of rock, it could be made of sand, and sometimes we have pockets of ground ice, and that's what I want to show you next. Permafrost can be very different in its distribution. So it's continuously found everywhere in the far north of Alaska, for example. And so here's the far north of Alaska along a latitudinal gradient. We have permafrost that's continuous, very thick, and very old. And as you move from, say, the North Slope of Alaska down to, say, Fairbanks, we move into the discontinuous and maybe even to the sporadic permafrost zones. So this means permafrost isn't found everywhere. The permafrost layer tends to be much thinner, much younger. Sometimes it's even little ice age permafrost, so just a few hundred years old. And what I love about discontinuous permafrost is it's really shaped by the modern ecosystem above it. So that peat layer, the vegetation layer, the snowpack conditions really set the stage for whether or not we find permafrost in a particular area. And the gray areas are the permafrost blobs separated by these white non-permafrost areas, which are all regions where water and hydrology can flow. So this is just a great incubator for eco-hydrology interactions. Okay, I have ground ice coming up later. So I spoke too soon, but I will show you some images of ground ice. I want to tell you why we care about permafrost. So permafrost, depending on exactly what we're considering in our inventories, contains somewhere between 1,100 and 1,600 billion tons of carbon. It's not the biggest carbon pool in our Earth environment, but it is a large carbon pool and it's a dynamic pool. And when I say that, I mean it's a relatively surface pool of carbon that is dynamically exchanging between the biosphere and the atmosphere. So when you consider the permafrost carbon pool from that lens, it's quite a substantial carbon pool. So permafrost stores certainly more carbon than global vegetation biomass, and it stores about twice as much carbon as is currently stored in the atmosphere. So the fate of that carbon pool is something that many of us, but I certainly have been working on for my whole career. The permafrost carbon feedback to climate can be represented very simply in this cartoon. We have lots of carbon. I like to say we have shit tons of carbon stored in permafrost in our biosphere here. It is locked away from much microbial activity because of frozen conditions. And when those thermal constraints on decomposition are released, some fraction of that organic matter stored in permafrost can become susceptible to microbial activity and mineralization, forming carbon dioxide as a redox product under both aerobic or anaerobic conditions, or methane under anaerobic and our lowest redox or poorest redox conditions. That carbon winds its way into the atmosphere because the gradient is up, where it can then contribute to the greenhouse effect. And what we used to call a positive feedback cycle sets the stage for a vicious cycle. At the heart of this vicious cycle is the fate of this permafrost carbon pool. What we currently know now is generated from Earth system models, and only a handful currently consider permafrost at all. And they consider only the simplest type of permafrost thaw. So very gradual thawing of surface permafrost over time. This type of thaw happens all across the Arctic, but it affects centimeters of permafrost over years to decades. So a fairly gradual thaw process. So through the Permafrost Carbon Network, which is a group I'm very active in, we took a handful of those models and conducted a MIP, a model intercomparison study. These studies used all the same kind of input conditions. And from this intercomparison study, we tried to learn about what do models currently tell us about the role of thaw in the Earth's climate system. So this is sort of summarizing the meta results from that intercomparison modeling study. We know that permafrost thaw will result in carbon emissions to the atmosphere. It will not result in complete loss of the permafrost carbon pool by any means. We anticipate between, about 15 to 20% of that carbon pool is likely vulnerable to loss. Some of that loss will be offset by tundra and Arctic greening and accelerated biomass production as a result of climate change. But it's not likely to be a complete offset. And so permafrost carbon emissions is like adding another major industrial player to the world emissions stage. Nonetheless, permafrost carbon emissions are dwarfed by anthropogenic emissions in these scenarios. Those plant biomass offsets, however, are important because they push the feedback generated by these permafrost carbon emissions onto climate past 2100. So that's what the models currently suggest. And we've learned from our scenarios that if we can use climate policy and climate mitigation to bring emissions down to something like a RCP 4.5 or a 2.6 scenario, we can keep some permafrost frozen. And we also improve our chances for a minimized permafrost carbon feedback because we keep plants productive and away from Arctic browning or drought stress. So climate policy has a strong role to play in minimizing the permafrost carbon feedback by saving permafrost into the future. Okay, so here's where I want to show you some pictures. So everything I've talked about so far deals with permafrost change under very simple and pretty standard situations. Again, that gradual thaw. This is really the only type of thaw that models, if they handle permafrost at all, that the models can conceptualize. Gradual, slow, and steady permafrost thaw. Think of this as like the tortoise. I want to introduce to you the hare of permafrost change. This is the abrupt thaw that is triggered in the types of ecosystems that I work in. These are wet, lowland, permafrost peatlands and forests. They are the most carbon-rich ecosystems, and they don't thaw like the models say they thaw. They thaw very differently because of ground ice. And so here is a picture of a permafrost core. We call these CIPRI cores. Here's my colleague, Jamie Hollingsworth at the Bonanza Creek LTR. And we have just drilled into one of my field sites, and this is a pure layer. I mean, beautiful. You can look right through it. Like you were always tempted to make a drink out of this. This is a lens of pure massive ice. There was frozen peat above it. And there's a lot of frozen mineral soil, permafrost mineral soil below it. This kind of ice lens causes abrupt permafrost thaw. And if you tour the permafrost tunnel in Alaska, you can see what that ice lens might look like, not if you're drilling down from the surface of the permafrost tunnel, but if you were, walking back through the tunnel. Look at this ice wedge. It is it's amazing. You don't get this bird's eye, well, it's not a bird's eye, it's like a mole perspective very often. So normally when we see ground ice, we're looking at it because we just happen to tap into it in a core. This is what it actually looks like, and it's shocking. They're just gorgeous. But when those ice wedges thaw, when the permafrost thaws, we see an abrupt state change on the landscape. Permafrost forests where trees could be supported because the surface was dry, flipping into these thermokarst bogs. So thermokarst means a land depression triggered by a thermal state change, in this case, permafrost thaw. So what started as a forest ends up as a lake. And all of these little ponds of water in this image from northwestern Canada used to be forest and now are extremely wet lakes and are being colonized by semi-aquatic vegetation. This is the kind of stuff that is triggered on the landscape when ice-rich permafrost thaws. More scenarios of change. Land sliding into rivers because of this instability caused by again, this thawing ice-rich permafrost. Big gullies and slumps. This is a mega slump in the Peel Plateau of northwestern Canada. Whether we're in a lowland or in an upland setting, all of these land surface expressions are united. They are all triggered by the thaw of ice-rich permafrost. And that kind of state change in surface conditions, in the ecology of a system, as you might imagine, takes with it any infrastructure, any kind of social or physical infrastructure that we depend on at the surface. So highways, railroads, airport runways. This is the parking lot in the University of Alaska Fairbanks, where I typically leave my field truck. It's now been consumed by an ice wedge thaw. Massive changes to that infrastructure that can pop up literally overnight. And so I just, I'm going to speed through this. I really want to impress upon you more of the pictures than the science that I've done. I just want to make the point that no aspect of abrupt thaw is really articulated in any Earth system model. It's not articulated by any IPCC prediction. We're trying to change that by convincing the modeling community and more sophisticated modelers that they need to consider these three-dimensional dynamic hydrologic changes associated with permafrost thaw. We've got their ear, but it's going to be really difficult to incorporate these fine scale processes into such large simulation space. We've tried to do that. I'm going to click through these and just explain what we've tried to do. We've built some very simple standalone numerical models projecting permafrost thaw like an ecologist. We think about this in a successional cycle. We have immediate impacts of thaw, longer term recovery of those ecosystems, loss of carbon soon after thaw, biomass offsets. We've tried to build numerical models that maybe can help the Earth system modeling community kind of articulate and visualize this space a little bit better. Again, our inventory-based models, or our numerical models so far, include both the rapid losses of permafrost carbon stocks that happen soon after fire, say the first 100 years, post-thaw, 100 years post-thaw, and then those losses recover. So we have empirical evidence of those deep permafrost carbon losses, but at the same time, we cannot forget that plants and surface biomass is also accumulating modern carbon from the atmosphere. We also have empirical data supporting that. So our numerical modeling and our inventory modeling takes into account both carbon losses and carbon gains, and not all models do that. And that gets me a little bit hot around the collar. When we do these independent, simple inventory models, what we learn is that even though abrupt thaw covers a very minor part of the landscape, it's a small scale phenomenon that carries a carbon punch. About 50% of carbon emissions from permafrost thaw can be tagged to these very fine scale changes. So if we're just sort of bean counting carbon change, that's a lot. So we have this abrupt thaw that's impacting a minor part of the landscape, but releasing the equivalent of 50% of what the models tell us gradual thaw all across the Arctic is releasing. So that's, that's pretty fascinating. But in our models, we also were able to track the fate of this permafrost carbon as release either as CO2, carbon dioxide, or as methane. And those have very different influences because of their change in radiative forcing in the climate system and in the atmosphere. When we account for the type of carbon being released, what we find is that by not accounting for abrupt thaw, our current models are underestimating the climate impacts of permafrost carbon release by 100%. So I want to conclude by bringing us back to where we started, which is rooted in the theme of legacies. There's a variety of legacies that make northern ecosystems unique, that drive our understanding of northern ecosystems. And many of those legacies, whether they be information or material legacies, are being eroded by these accelerated disturbance regimes. We often think of fire as leading to those erosions, but there are other disturbances as well. This is creating novel ecosystems, novel formation of conditions of soil and vegetation, and we're well poised to help land managers think through what those novel conditions mean to current and future conservation and management goals. My final sort of scientific conclusion is that abrupt change, abrupt ecological, hydrologic, or disturbance change is different than gradual changes. It's not gradual change on steroids or sped up. These lead to unique trajectories of ecosystem formation over time, novel patterns of recovery. And so it's not just enough to think about gradual permafrost thaw. We need our models to consider the suite of permafrost thaw conditions that are actually occurring on the landscape. And we can't just play with a knob of the speed of that change. It's not the same thing. So I like to conclude my talks with a word that is very meaningful to me. It was taught to me by Sheila Watt-Cloutier, who is a very important Canadian diplomat. This is a Nook word that's often used to mean, in translation, weather and sort of the connection between people and weather, but it is much broader than that. It is our relationship with all of our environment and the connectedness between people and their environment. And I would just like to leave you with the concept that SELA also includes our interactions and connectedness through our shared atmosphere. We do share an atmosphere. It is being impacted both by wildfire conditions and by permafrost thaw. We share that as a global community, and we share that with Northerners who actually depend on permafrost for their livelihood. So with that, I will thank you for your attention, and I am really looking forward to spending some more time in conversation with you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, I had some problems with the video there. Thank you very much for this great talk. I think we have time for probably one quick question, but we have saved all the other questions and we will answer them in the discussion. So please join us for the discussion, which we will start. Well, we probably have to actually start it in 1 minute, but we will do one question here and then we will switch over. Now, the first question was regarding the conceptual models. How different is the work to the work of Howard Lutz and Les Biorek? I hope I said that correctly.
Now, I'm not sure I totally understood that question. So maybe could we, is it so written?
Yes, it's written in the Q&A box, and it's unfortunately not much longer than I rephrased it here, but
yeah. Oh, how different. So I'm thinking, okay, so Marty, great question. So I'm guessing you're referring to the fire conceptual model. I mean, this is the work built on the shoulders of these giants. So Les Biorek, um, created the foundation of fire succession that the Bonanza Creek LTR is built on. I think where that conceptual model differs is that it incorporates some of the resilience mechanisms in a much more quantitative state that vary across the landscape. So the original sort of fire conceptual model was really geared at a portion of the landscape. It had a static peat layer, not too thick, not too thin. By blasting our sites in the Bonanza Creek LTER to cover a wider range of peat depth conditions, we really came to this kind of alternative state model. And we don't actually view it as two alternative states anymore. But it is clearly driven by that peat layer. And I don't know that that was formally articulated in the original design of the Bonanza Creek LTR. I think it was qualitatively built in, but we have quantitative metrics and thresholds that dictate that state change into a deciduous competitive hierarchy now. But it's a good question.